Weird hotel encounter. So this happened about 7 months ago. I was visiting San Diego for job interviews and staying at my favorite hotel in Sorrento Mesa. For background, I'm a 40-year-old man and a pretty big guy. I'm 6 1 inch and a former strip club bouncer. Now, on to the weirdness. On my third night, I was up pretty late, after hanging out with some old friends after my interviews. I got back to the hotel around 2 a.m. with some Sonny's donuts. After eating a few, drinking a few more, and watching South Park post-COVID, I decided to have a smoke before going to bed. This made it now around 3 a.m. So I go downstairs, walk out front to the smoking area by the fountain, but there's another couple who are also staying at the hotel already there. I didn't want to impose, so I decided to just walk around the outside parts of the hotel while I smoked. I walked around the pool, the barbecue area, the basketball courts, then started back for the side door. As I did, a black sedan drove up alongside me and stopped. The window rolled down, and a tiny Asian woman asked if I knew how to get out of the parking lot and back to the street. Now, from where we were when she asked me, this was literally in a straight line about 150 feet in front of her, so I thought she was drunk or just blind. So I just politely said yes, just keep going straight, and turned left at the tree. She then asked me if I could get in the car and show her. Now again, I'm a former strip club bouncer, and this woman looked very much like Walmart Ali Wong. There was absolutely no intimidation factor, but for some reason, I instantly felt uneasy. Again, it was literally right in front of her. She could see the road. Also, the windows were all tinted far more than they should have been, and I honestly couldn't tell if anyone else was in the car. I used the smoking as an excuse to not get in the car, but she said she didn't mind, and gave me a very creepy smile. I politely declined and again pointed out that the road was literally right there, so I'd just be walking back in 5 seconds anyway. She again asked if I would get in and show her. This was feeling like a weird kid ice cream truck situation. I mean, guys, how often do decently good-looking women just drive up and ask you to get in their car at 3 a.m. in a hotel parking lot? How often does anyone ask a big bearded guy to just hop on in the car under these circumstances? Nothing about this was right. Again, I politely declined as I finished my smoke, and was luckily already standing right at the hotel side door when all this started. So I just went in. The woman just drove off as she rolled up the window right exactly to the exit she just asked me to show her to. So I told the front desk about it, and they said they'd keep an eye out. But I'm quite sure nothing was ever done or came of it. Just one of those things that really makes me wonder, what the hell did she want me in the car so badly for? A pretty man I'm not. So it had to be some kind of scam. I just wonder exactly how much danger I was in. A homeless man got a surprise when he came knocking on my door. I was scrolling through old posts, and one reminded me of this story that happened about a decade ago. My kids and I lived in a little house on the corner of my street. Occasionally I'd see a drifter wandering in the area. He wasn't bothering anyone, and the house was at a very busy thoroughfare, so I never thought much of it. He seemed to be minding his business, so I minded mine. One day, while I was hanging out on my front porch with the kiddos, 5 and 1 at the time, he came up to the edge of my walkway, but didn't actually set foot on my property, asking if I had some food and water. It was summer in Florida, and I'm not heartless, so I told him to wait there and give me a minute. I take the kids inside with me, grab a few bottles of water, make a couple sandwiches, and throw some single-serving snacks in a bag for him. I go back outside without the kids, give it to him. He thanks me and leaves. Every week or so, he'd come by, and I, or my babysitter, if I was at work, would give him some water bottles and food. He was always polite, always said thank you, and immediately moved it along. After about a month of this, I let a friend who was down on his luck stay with me since I had the extra space short term. My friend was 5'11" and 250 pounds. Well, I got home from work one evening and my friend was sitting on my porch waiting for me. He looked agitated. The drifter had been by again, but this time he'd come up to the door and knocked. Any other time, he'd always happened upon me or my kid's sitter while we were on the porch. Apparently, he was very surprised to see my very large friend answer the door, and immediately said something along the lines of, "I thought it was just her and the kids living here," and started acting antsy. And then my friend saw the knife he was hiding in his hand. Wham! He shoved the dude off my porch and told him if he ever saw him within 3 blocks of my house again, he'd break both of his arms. My kid's father, we were splitsies and living separately at the time, was livid when I told him. He worked for a security systems company and immediately set an appointment up to have a security system installed in my house after that, and paid the monthly fee himself. He absolutely hated that particular friend of mine, but thanked him profusely for looking out for me and the kids. All in all, I was upset and scared, but also sad. I helped keep that man fed for over a month at that point. Never did see him again after that, though, fortunately. Creepy Tinder date may have had a secret. G'day, everyone. I decided to go ahead and make this account to type this story out and get sucked into the rabbit hole that is this app. I don't know if I actually avoided something sinister for a fact, but I'd rather play it all safe and say that I did. I'm 29F, and while I'm well-traveled and have been around quite a bit, I do occasionally make some pretty rookie mistakes. My fault, and I make no excuses. I try to remain diligent and alert, but I'm very capable of letting my guard down. So after being here in the US for about 2 months, I decided that I was bored sitting around my unit watching 90 Day Fiancé, so I decided to make the old dating profiles again. I made no specific intentions known about what I was interested in accomplishing, as I don't really know myself. I just wanted someone to hang out with and see where it goes naturally. I ended up matching with this one bloke who had shared interests with me. We chatted a bit over the app, and eventually I felt okay to give him my number. After talking back and forth for a couple of weeks, I agreed to a meetup. We met at a pub and have a couple of drinks. I'll admit at first I didn't recognize him because he didn't resemble his photos to the extent that I was expecting. He didn't look bad by any means, but I could tell that he used older pictures and edited them enough to where he seemed more appealing. I swear I'm not trying to sound superficial because he was cute, just not what I was expecting. But I also think we've hit a point in social media culture where it's safe to assume that we won't see the same thing in real life as we do online, and that's okay. We did hit it off. We discussed the usual first date stuff, then we got into more detail. I told him about back home and work, and how life was different than here in the States. At one point, we were talking and holding hands, and I felt comfortable enough to let him kiss me. Well, he asked me as we were leaving if I wanted to go back to his place for a cup of coffee. I told him I knew what coffee really meant, and that I didn't want to do that on a first date. He assured me it would be 1 cup of coffee, and that he would give me a lift home so that I didn't have to call an Uber. I accepted his offer, and we walked to his apartment, which was a few blocks away. As we were going upstairs, he made a few questionable remarks. He mentioned how I wasn't like most girls because I accepted his invitation and alluded that, you never know, I could be a psychopath. He then motioned with his eyes down to my dress and inquired about my titty size. I told him again that I was sorry, but the night would not end with him getting lucky. As we got into his unit, he dismissed himself to the toilet and left me sitting on his bed. It was a studio and he didn't have a couch. As I'm sitting there and waiting for him to finish doing whatever he was actually doing, I noticed in the corner by his bed that he had 2 masks. One was a cartoon-looking goat mask and another was a cat, or maybe a tiger. What was more alarming was that he also had a Bowie knife and a small woodcutter's axe only a short distance away from them. Upon further observation, I also noticed there was a black jumper draped over a dresser. Then, on his bedside table, there were a pair of latex gloves. Okay, I don't much feel like being murdered tonight. I got up and calmly left the unit. Then I made haste down the stairs and down the street where I was able to catch a lift. Now look, I may have just really hurt his feelings because he had no malicious intent. But if that's all that happened, then I'd prefer that over the possible alternative. All of these items alone wouldn't have been that bad. But all of these random items within a short walk from each other, I'd rather just not chance it. I do feel bad for leaving a person, but I don't feel bad about leaving what could have potentially been a dangerous situation. That, along with his random personality change, was enough for me to make the call that I made. As of recently, I noticed that he either blocked me from Tinder or deleted the app. I was almost trafficked at work yesterday. I want to tell this story to warn others. I, 18F, live in Maryland, USA. I work at a very popular burger restaurant. I work at the payment window, which is where I stand all night. I'm very friendly. I know sometimes a smile and a compliment can make someone's day a little better. Just this same night before the creeper came, I had a customer tell me I was so fucking happy and she loved me for it. That gave me the courage and energy to survive this next interaction. I'm used to the awkward comments and stares from old men. I'm sure it's my friendliness that attracts them. Our uniforms are not revealing. They think I'm naive. Maybe I am, a lot more than I thought. I'm fully aware of the dangers of trafficking. This particular old man came through just before 6. He pretended to not hear his order, then laughed like it was a joke between two friends. This is not uncommon. It's an old man thing. No red flags yet. I tell him his total and he hands me all but the change. When he does this, he waves the money around, making me chase it. I was able to snatch the cash, but again, it was just an old man thing. Not concerned yet. He stared at the company name on my shirt and asked if that was my name. I don't wear a name tag for this reason. I joked that I was going to change my name permanently to that. He perked up. At this point, I should state that he was white, mid-60s, 70s, driving a small white SUV with a kayak on top. He had some scruff on his face and was holding a phone to his ear this entire time. When I finally began to engage with him, he moved the phone to be facing me. Looking back, I believe he was recording me. At no point did he speak into the phone or acknowledge it in any way. He probed with more pressing questions. Here's the thing. I have the same last name as someone from US history. Most old people like talking about that stuff, so I told him my last name. He didn't reflect or laugh, he just accepted and continued asking questions. That's when I started to get this sinking feeling. He still owed me change, I told him. He grabbed another $1 and handed it to me, but he wouldn't let go. He wanted to know my first name, and I dodged answering because I was getting creeped out. He wouldn't let go of the money and was practically drooling for more data about me. I gave him a name I don't use, and he smiled, finally letting go. I got his change and told him to have a nice day. I then immediately left the window and told one of my co-workers about the weird experience. He returned just 2 hours later. I didn't recognize his car on the cameras until he got to my window. I hadn't thought too much about our interaction and was busy texting my dad about whether or not a chicken sandwich was a burger. My stomach dropped when I saw his face. I have many regulars, all of whom I'd have been happy to see. I hope he doesn't become one. I'll call the police. He smiled and said, "Hey, the one with the last name." I half smiled back and wished for the days when we all wore masks. I tell him his total and he makes me chase the money again. For the entire time, he had his phone against his ear, facing me. He starts asking even more intimate questions about me. I lie or dodge them best I can, giving him 0 correct answers, wanting our interaction to be as short as possible. Some of the questions he asked me: how often do you work? What time do you leave? How old are you? For that one, I knew he wouldn't leave without a number, and I had a nasty feeling the younger wouldn't be the better. So I said, probably 20s. He joked about me being legal. I made a face and tried to get his change even faster. He asked if I had a boyfriend. I was getting more and more nervous, so my answers started getting more sarcastic. I told him boys were trouble. He specifically talked about himself and said he'd treat me right. I handed him his receipt and told him to have a great night. He threw his hands in the air and was saying, "Don't be like that. I'll treat you right." I shut my window and said, "Bye." He made a bit more of a fuss, but eventually drove forward. From his question about when I got off work, I believed he was watching the restaurant. I was shaking by this time and called my mom. She immediately drove up. I talked to my manager, and I was a little unsure of the car's color, so he checked the camera for me. Shout out to my manager, he's the best. I continued at my window, watching for the old guy, but I didn't see him again. I left an hour early and gave my manager specific instructions to not place a girl at my window. He agreed. Friend's creepy religion and a weird sleepover at his house. Okay, folks, so this happened when I was 14. I'm 29 as of the time of writing this. I remember this story from time to time, meaning like once or twice every few years. It still gets me in a weird mood for some reason. Anyways, I was walking with one of my friends in the city the other day. I tried holding her hand, but then she thought I just bumped into her and apologized, so I was able to recover smoothly. Then I saw a group of kids skateboard past us, and lo and behold, that was the thing that sparked this memory, so I figured I'd write it down. So I'm not going to use this kid's real name, so I'll just call him Vinny. I come from a town where the people you went to school with in kindergarten were the same kids you graduated with. Vinny moved to our school about halfway through the year. When new kids came to our school, everybody flocked to them. At 14, I was kind of a dork, but also kind of a douche, which made me surprisingly likable to most people. Vinny would always sit by himself during lunch. Something I found amusing about him was that he would get infuriated if people asked him if he skated. I took that as a challenge to try and piss him off, and it worked. The first time he and I had a class together, I remember the teacher asking him if he had his books yet. He responded with, "My wife never confirmed my school schedule with the front office." I remember everybody thought that was funny. You're 14 years old and you have a wife. He was clearly trying to get one over on the teacher. My friends and I were skating after school and we saw Vinny. I remember talking to my friends about what he said, and we all became oddly infatuated with this kid. It took some doing, but after about a week of letting him hang out with us, he became one of the boys. One of my buddies asked if we could go sleep at his house on Friday night, under the guise that we took turns at staying at each other's house to skate, play video games, and smoke the green stuff. He looked perturbed, which is something I wish mattered to me back then. But the next day at school, he did say it was okay after asking his parents. My buddies and I rode our bikes to where he lived, with clothes for the night, and our skateboards strapped to our bags. We met his family, who at face value seemed completely fine. Then things got a little weird. First, his dad had a huge weapons collection. At the time, I thought it was awesome. He even took us out into a field by a canal to shoot some of his assault rifles. I know, this wasn't cool of him without the parents' consent. Next, we met Vinny's wife. Yeah, the girl was real. She was also 26. While we lived in the southern US, even this was taboo. They would hold hands and stuff. At the time, we thought this was dope. It was like dating a senior when you're a freshman, only he was in high school and she paid taxes. Things kind of got to a new level of weird when Vinny's dad had his arm around Vinny's mom, and his other arm around a girl that couldn't have been terribly older than we were at the time. Apparently that was also his wife. We then spent about 2 hours praying with the family in the living room. I was raised Catholic, but couldn't determine which religion they were practicing. Once we finished with that, we went outside to start skateboarding. After a few minutes, his dad came outside and ordered us into the house. Vinny's mother then had us stand in line outside of the bathroom to take a bath. It still skeeves me out, but I remember we weren't allowed to drain the water from the tub. I was the last one to bathe. Also, all of the mirrors in the house were covered with sheets. I don't know the significance of this. It makes more sense to me to not have mirrors at that point. We were told to go to bed, even though the sun wasn't even down yet. Vinny went to bed with his wife. The three of us that remained just laid there in one single queen-sized bed and talked about how much fun we weren't having. The final straw for the night was having to hear Vinny's parents, and maybe the other woman, doing the dirty in the next room. It was almost 11 p.m. when we decided to just get on our bikes and leave. It was dark and we had to ride through some bad neighborhoods, but we made it safe to my buddy's house. Vinny's mother would also later call our parents and leave some cryptic messages, which implied trouble. Vinny was pulled from school about a week later, and we never saw him again. I don't know what that family was into. Maybe it wasn't creepy at all, and I just didn't understand. All I know is that we felt uncomfortable. I have no issues with religion, but if this was part of their practice, I think it's a little weird. Out of curiosity, I went to find Vinny on Facebook. All I can confirm is that he, his mother, father, and one of his sisters had died. There were no public records of what happened to them, or if they even died at the same time. Probably not the creepiest story out there, but one I still come back to. It's worth the tell, and it's an interesting memory. Creepy men stalking us on a camping trip. To set the stage for this story, we must go back to the far-off year of 1988. The location is the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. I was 10 years old, and with me was my mom, dad, best friend, and our golden retriever, Amber. We were very much an outdoor family, and had many camping trips before this and since. But to this day, when I think about it, I still remember the terror I felt that weekend so long ago. After a brief talk with my father recently, it kind of came back to the front of my mind. He also was able to fill in a few details that I had forgotten. This holiday was like many others. We packed up the station wagon with everything we would need for a hike into one of our favorite lakes to camp at. To make this trip even more exciting for me was the fact it was my birthday weekend, and I got to pick this lake. After we arrived at the trailhead and got our packs on, my dad got his sidearm out and strapped it on his belt. In Oregon, open carry was permitted in national forests, and my dad always had a gun on his hip while in the woods, which always added a sense of security. We had a close call with a bear one time in which it came in handy. The lake was about a 4-mile moderate hike in through some thick forest, but the trail itself was well maintained and was never very busy, so it was going to be a very pleasant hike in. We started off on our hike, and back in the 80s it was not uncommon to have your dog off leash on the trails in the forest, so we let Amber run and do her thing. She was a good dog and never ran off for too long or jumped on people. She did love people though, and speaking of people, we had not seen anyone else on the trail after about 2 miles in on the hike, which was nice since it was just all of us talking, laughing, and enjoying nature. My best friend and I started to hike ahead of everyone else because we were so energized and excited about finding the first and best tent spot once we got to the lake. Amber was bounding ahead of us and having a great time too. We were about 20 yards ahead of my parents when Amber stopped dead in her tracks. I thought she maybe saw a chipmunk or something, maybe a bird, but her hackles came up and she let out the lowest of growls. She never growls, so we stopped walking, and I thought maybe a bear or deer or something was just off the trail and she saw or heard it. We immediately started walking backwards and my parents caught up to us. My dad asked us what was going on. I told him that Amber is up the trail and is growling at something. He tells us girls to stay back with my mom, and he walks ahead to where Amber was at on the trail. My dad gets up to her and looks around. I hear Amber whimper a bit while looking off the trail. My dad comforts her and calls her back and walks back to us. He says it must have been an animal, and he did not see anything right off the trail or ahead of us. He says to let him take the lead, and we continue to hike. It did not take long before it was forgotten, and Amber and the rest of us are all having a good time again. We arrived at the lake, and much to my delight, there was no one else there camping. The water was clean and blue, and the shade from the trees made the whole scene just perfect. My friend and I found the best spot to set up our tent, and my parents followed suit. After we had camp set up, my folks went off to fish just down the hill, and my friend and I took off with Amber to walk around to the other side of the lake to catch salamanders. We only made it about in 1/8 of a mile when Amber stopped and started to growl. We stopped and looked around and heard brush rustling. Then right in front of us, a man walked out of the trees. Amber stayed right by our sides and started to bare her teeth. He was taller than my dad, so at least 6'4", was very skinny, but had very broad shoulders. He was clean cut and was wearing black jeans and a white polo shirt with loafers. I mean, he did not look like he had hiked at all, or was even dressed for the outdoors. He almost looked like he came out of church. We just stood there trying to process this situation when Amber began to bark. The guy just stood there, not moving, and he smiled, like the creepiest smile. It felt like someone who thought that was what a smile was supposed to look like. Amber kept barking, and this got my parents' attention, and they looked up to us and called out to us to come back. We complied and started to walk back towards them. My dad met us halfway and told us to go back to the campsite, and he was going to talk to this guy. We got back to our camp, and my mom sat with us. I could hear my dad asking the guy if he needed help, or was he a fellow camper who had just set up a camp away from the lake. My dad was being polite and calm, but I could see he was on guard and trying to feel out the situation. Now is the time to mention that my dad was ex-Army and can be very intimidating when needed. The conversation continues. The guy told my dad he was just on a walk and did not mean to intrude on us. The guy says goodbye and walks back into the woods. My dad walked back to camp, sat down, and told us that he thinks the guy may just be a yuppie camper and does not know much about the outdoors. But my dad said that he got a weird vibe off him and would be keeping an eye out for him. Amber stayed by our side and was calm, yet she kept looking towards the direction the guy went. A bit more time goes by, and we have a nice campfire going, and the sun was starting to set. We cooked some dinner and made s'mores afterwards. My friend and I decided to go to our tent and read some books and tell each other some scary stories. Amber followed us to the tent and laid right outside of the door. My parents walked down to the lake to sit, have a beer, and just chill. They were never more than 50 yards away. Not long after my parents walked away, I hear Amber start to growl. Then we hear footsteps coming from the woods behind our tent. My friend and I turn off our flashlight and go quiet to listen. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the woods. We then hear heavy breathing and a grunting sound. Amber starts to bark, and we then hear the footsteps retreat to the woods. Amber whimpers a bit, and I then hear my parents walking back to the camp. I go out and tell them what happened. My dad said that he heard Amber barking, and that is why they came back up. I asked my dad what we should do. What is going on? And if that strange guy was the one creeping around. He tells me that we will see about moving camp in the morning, since we still have 3 days left on the trip, and nothing has happened to warrant just leaving. But he said that we will play it by ear, and just be a little more vigilant. And if something changes, we will decide what to do next. He tells us to try to get some sleep, and we all turn in for the night. The next morning, we get up and have breakfast. After breakfast, we head down to the lake to fish. It was a beautiful day, and we were having so much fun the events from the prior day were almost forgotten. We decided around lunchtime that we would go for a short hike to the waterfall that is up from the lake. We were gone for only about an hour, and when we came back, we found our tents opened and our sleeping bags drug out on the ground. My dad tells us to hang back with Mom, and he goes to investigate. He comes back and says nothing is missing, but it was not an animal that did this. He says we should break camp, hike back to the car, and find another spot to camp for the next couple of days. I could tell my dad was not wanting to frighten us, but I heard the urgency in his voice. I was very disappointed, but if it meant we could enjoy the rest of the trip and not worry about some creep messing with us, then it was worth it. We broke camp and started our hike back. Dad was in the lead, and we were double timing it and made it back to car in record time. As we walk over to the car, we see that one of our tires was flat. Not a big deal, we always had a spare, but when my dad bent down to start taking the lugs off, we swore. It was not just flat. Someone slashed the tire. Dad changed that tire in record time, and we threw everything into the car, and he goes to turn the car on, but it would not start. Dad swears, gets out of the car and pops the hood. He says, "Shit." It turns out someone took our spark plug wires. Old cars like that Chevy wagon didn't have internal hood releases. You could just pop the hood from the outside. Dad slams the hood, says some very colorful words, and kicks some rocks. We were stuck and no one else was at the trailhead. We were stranded. My parents are calm under pressure, and after a few minutes of discussion, it was decided that Dad would start walking down the road until he could hitch a ride to town and go to the auto parts store. Mom and the rest of us were going to wait with the car and look for someone to hopefully pull into the trailhead and help us. A few hours go by and no one has come to the trailhead. It is getting hot and we are hungry and tired. My mom makes us some lunch and we go to sit under a tree to cool off. Amber is by our side and was calm, but then we hear a voice. Amber leaps up and starts to whimper. The creepy guy from yesterday comes down the trail and is asking my mom if we need help. My mom tells him we are fine, that it is being settled, and my dad will be back soon. This creep then tells her that his camp is close, and he's parked on the old fire road that is near the lake, and asks us if we would like to come back to his camp and wait until my dad returns. Mom sternly tells him no, that we will just wait here and thank you anyway. He does not like this. He tells my mom that is not safe out here for a pretty lady and 2 young girls. My mom, like my dad, is no pushover and asserts herself again that we do not need any help, and to please just leave us alone. The guy just stands there, smiles wide, and then just turns around and leaves. My mom is visibly shaken, and us girls were just a bit scared. My mom comes over to us and tells us that we need to stay close, do not wander, and that we will be okay. My friend and I are really kind of freaked out and are just hoping my dad will make it back soon. After about another 30 minutes, the creepy guy comes back. This time, though, he is not alone and has a slightly younger guy with him. The other guy is dressed as a yuppie camper and had a very stern look on his face. My mother stands her ground as they approach. Amber starts to low growl and her hackles go up. The 2 guys flank us and one of them flashes a gun tucked into his belt. The older guy tells us that we need to go with them and that they were not asking. My mom backs up next to us and without taking her eyes off them, reaches to her belt and pulls out her Bowie knife. My mom said we will not be going and that they need to leave now. The 2 men did not even flinch at this and said that we will come with them or they will hurt us. At this moment, though, Amber goes from just growling to barking and puts herself between us and them. This makes the guys stop. My mom yells that they need to leave now. They start backing up, and at that moment, we hear a truck pulling into the trailhead parking lot. At the sight of the truck, the guys start to walk away fast and disappear into the tree line. The truck was a forest ranger, and he had my dad with him. My dad jumped out of the truck and ran over to us asking if we were okay. The ranger came over and asked who those men were and if we were okay. My mom explained everything while my dad hugged us girls and told us we will be okay. The ranger takes off to go looking for the men. My dad tells us that he was about 5 miles from the town when the ranger picked him up and took him the rest of the way to get the part for the car. He then drove him back to our car. After hearing what happened, my dad was pissed and wanted to find the guys who tried to kidnap us. And that had been terrorizing us for the past 24 hours. The ranger came back and told us that he had almost caught up to them, but they sped away in their truck with a camper in tow. They had been parked behind a small ridge behind the lake on an old logging road. He did not get a plate, but he radioed a description of the men and their truck and camper to the local sheriff's office. He also took our information and said he would pass it on to them. He waited with us until Dad had the car fixed, and we were able to leave. We decided to not continue camping and instead drive a couple of hours to spend the last 2 days of the trip at the beach and stay in a hotel. A few days later, a deputy called my dad and told him they never did find the men. He said that it was most likely a crime of opportunity after seeing a woman with 2 girls in tow. He was sure they had been watching us from off the trail and had messed with our camp to judge how my dad would react. When my dad seemed to be too big of a threat, they sabotaged our car, hoping to put us in a position where we were vulnerable. He said they would follow up with us if they find out anything else, but according to my dad, nothing ever came of it. Years later, I tried to do some research on crimes in that area of Oregon during the 80s that might have involved something like we experienced. All I could find was a few reports of campers being robbed and a few cars broken into. There was one case of a young lady and a dog going missing from an area near there, but it was never determined what had happened to her, or even if it was something bad or she just ran away. I can tell you that we did go back to that lake a few years later and had a very uneventful camping trip. It was nice to go back and find some joy in a spot that was special to me. I really hope those creepy guys never hurt anyone and maybe were caught for other crimes. I will never know though. I just hope to never run into a situation like that again. I can say that having a dog along with us helped our situation. She was the hero and kept us alert. Amber went on to live until she was 12 years old and passed with her favorite people around her. Remember to stay safe, stay watchful, and it never hurts to have a sweet, brave dog with you.